Thanks for joining us for the Season 1 finale of the Texas Generals, presented by the Texas Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. In this episode, we'll be profiling General John Bell Hood, who commanded the famous Hood's Texas Brigade. Recognized for his bravery, daring, and courage by both Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, Hood was beloved by his troops and maligned by his critics. And in this episode, hopefully we'll be looking at both sides of that argument. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, be sure and remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel.
The very soul of honor and knighthood lived in that shattered frame. Neither wounds, nor sickness, nor danger, nor poverty, nor the defeat of the cause he fought so heroically could share the dauntless spirit or ruffle the composure of the polished and modest gentleman. New Orleans Times-Picayune, August the 31st, 1879, on the death of General John Bell Hood.
I really think that General Hood was an intense man. He was really not stern, but very serious most of the time. And so that was the soldiers' impressions. But the soldiers loved him, even after the war, with all the stuff that happened after Chickamauga. The soldiers of Hood's Texas Brigade never said anything bad about him whatsoever, ever.
John Bell Hood's story starts in Owensville, Kentucky on June the 1st, 1831. The fourth of 9 children born to Dr. John Willis Hood and Theodosia French. John's father taught medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, which left John and his siblings in the care of his mother for much of the year. Hood's grandfathers, Lucas Hood, a veteran of the Indian Wars, and James French, a Revolutionary War veteran, gave John an appreciation of military life. And so in 1849, with the help of his uncle, Congressman Richard French, John received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Like many of the cadets from the South, Hood struggled academically. His weakest subjects were philosophy and French, and his strongest mathematics and drawing. During his senior year, Hood accumulated 196 demerits out of the maximum permissible of 200. Most were for minor infractions, from talking in class, being late to church, and dancing on the piazza. His most egregious, though, was for being absent from his quarters, most likely while visiting Benny Haven's Tavern, a local off-limits cadet hangout. For this offense, he was stripped of his position as lieutenant of the Corps of Cadets by the new superintendent, Robert E. Lee. Despite his demerits and middling grades, he graduated with the class of 1853, 44th out of 55. His class also included future Union generals Philip Sheridan, James McPherson, who was killed at the Battle of Atlanta, and John M. Schofield, who Hood would face later at the Battle of Franklin. Upon graduation, Hood was appointed as a second lieutenant in the United States 4th Infantry and assigned to Fort Jones in Northern California.
Today we're at Fort Mason in present-day Mason, Texas. In March of 1855, at the urging of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, the United States Congress authorized 2 new cavalry regiments to provide frontier defense for Texas. Davis handpicked the officers for the new U.S. 2nd Cavalry. Like Davis, most of the officers were West Point graduates and Southerners. Albert Sidney Johnston was selected as the colonel and Robert E. Lee as the lieutenant colonel. John Bell Hood joined the 2nd U.S. Cavalry and made the move from Jefferson Barracks in Missouri to here at Fort Mason.
In July of 1857, while leading a reconnaissance patrol near the headwaters of the Devil's River, Hood encountered a Comanche camp. In the ensuing fight, outnumbered and hampered by brush fires set by the Indian women, Hood and his men were forced into hand-to-hand combat. At the end of the day, 19 Comanches were killed, along with 2 of the cavalrymen, and 5 wounded, including Hood, who took an arrow in the hand. The fight with the Indians also revealed Hood's traits as a soldier. his willingness to attack against overwhelming odds, and his disregard for his own safety by leading his men from the front.
Hood quickly recovered from his wound and was promoted to first lieutenant of Company K and given command of Camp Colorado. In 1860, he was offered the position of chief instructor of cavalry at West Point, which was a pretty coveted position. But he turned down the offer to remain here on the frontier.
After the fall of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Hood tendered his resignation from the U.S. Army and proceeded to Montgomery, Alabama, then the capital of the new Confederate States of America, to offer his services not from his home state of Kentucky, but from his adopted state of Texas. He was commissioned a lieutenant and ordered to report to his old commander, Robert E. Lee, in Richmond. On arriving in Richmond, Lee ordered Lieutenant Hood to report to Colonel John Bankhead Magruder in Yorktown to train his cavalry troops. Hood soon found out that being a lieutenant training cavalry troops commanded by captains, even inexperienced captains, was going to be a problem. Magruder remedied the problem by making Hood a captain, but then the seniority based on commission dates became an issue with the recalcitrant captains, so Magruder promoted Hood to major. After the Battle of Big Bethel on June the 10th, 1861, which Hood didn't participate in, he was determined to capture one of the patrols that were being sent nightly by Union General Benjamin Butler down the James River Road. After waiting and hiding for several days with his cavalry troops, Hood and his troops attacked a Union scouting party, killing 2 and capturing 11. It was a minor skirmish, but the praise that he received from Magruder and Lee earned him a promotion to lieutenant colonel. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, 20 new companies of Texans were arriving to join the 12 companies already there that made up the 1st Texas Battalion under the command of Colonel Lewis Wigfall. Hood was recalled from Magruder and made colonel and ordered to organize the 4th Texas Infantry Regiment after the authoritarian Colonel R.T.P. Allen, who was hated by officers and men alike, was run out of camp by the Texans. At Rocket's Landing and later at Camp Bragg, which was called Camp Texas by the Texans, Hood trained and drilled his men until they were ordered to Dumfries to join newly appointed Brigadier General Wigfall to form the Texas Brigade, which would soon bear his name and become the most famous fighting unit in the Confederacy. During the winter of 1861-62, the newly formed Texas Brigade, which now consisted of the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry Regiments, along with the 18th Georgia, suffered from an exceptionally cold winter and an epidemic of measles. There, Hood continued to train the 4th, in addition to defending the Virginia side of the Potomac River from Union incursions. On March the 7th, 1862, while a regiment broke winter quarters and began moving towards Fredericksburg, Hood learned that he'd been appointed the new brigade commander with the rank of brigadier general after Lewis Wigfall had resigned after his election to the Confederate States Senate position from Texas. Hood's first real engagement with the Texas Brigade took place during the Peninsula Campaign in May 1862. The Texas Brigade was now part of William Whiting's new division. The division moved by train from Fredericksburg to Richmond and then marched to Yorktown. Union General George McClellan had the majority of his troops backing up the peninsula from Yorktown to Williamsburg, but he sent General William Franklin's division up the York River to land at Eltham's Landing and cut off Confederate General Joe Johnston's retreat before he could reach Richmond. General Whiting gave Hood the job of stopping Franklin before he could reach Barnumsville, Virginia, until the Confederate trains had all passed.
Hood's brigade was assigned to guard the supply trains of the Army of Northern Virginia under Joseph Johnston. And so on May 7th, it was the first encounter with a sizable Union force. And on the march before the battle, John Bell Hood is leading his troops down a road. And there was Union pickets or skirmishers, and they were hiding up in a tree. And so one of the federal soldiers had John Bell Hood in his sights. And he jumped out of the tree and he was aiming his rifle towards John Bell Hood. And if the soldier would have been successful, that would have been the end of John Bell Hood. Well, the thing was, though, also that General Hood told his soldiers, do not load your guns. We're going to wait till we get into the Confederate lines. to load the guns. And so nobody had their guns loaded except for one soldier, Private John Deal of the 4th Texas. And so when the soldier jumped down, the federal soldier jumped down, Private Deal took his rifle right away and shot him and saved General Hood's life.
Hood went on to lead the attack and push the Federals back to the protection of their gunboats on the Pamunkey River. Later, Joe Johnston asked Hood what would have happened if he'd asked the Texans to attack instead of gently probe the enemy. Hood replied without hesitation, "I suppose, General, they would have driven them into the river and tried to swim out and capture the gunboats." The next big engagement that Hood and his brigade were engaged in was at Gaines' Mill on the third day of the 7 Days Battle on June the 27th, 1862.
John Bell Hood was very attached to the 4th Texas. That was his old regiment. And he made a promise. He goes, the next time the 4th Texas goes into battle, I'll lead the regiment myself. And he did. He led the regiment at Gaines' Mill. He was under fire. And it's a miracle he didn't get wounded or killed because he was right there in the forefront.
In what would become the largest charge in the Civil War, Hood spearheaded the attack that broke the Union line. As the Union forces retreated towards the Chickahominy swamps, Federal artillery continued to fire to cover their retreat. Hood's brigade, along with Law's Mississippi and Alabama troops, moved to silence the guns and ran into a Union cavalry charge from the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, Hood's old unit from Fort Mason. Hood's old commander, Captain Charles Whiting, had his horse shot out from under him and landed almost at Hood's feet and was taken prisoner. Later that night, as Hood rode over the field, he heard his name being called. It was Captain William Chambliss, an old friend who was wounded but still alive. After they greeted each other, Hood ordered him taken to the field hospital to get the same attention that his own officers were getting. After the battle, the division moved to a camp just outside of Richmond for a month-long rest. Passes were issued, and soon the streets of Richmond were filled with Texans looking for entertainment, including Hood, who was seen with Fitzhugh Lee enjoying the theater, undoubtedly with female companionship, but he was yet to become the darling of Richmond society that he would. Hood also visited the Libby prison to see his friends Captain Whiting and Chambliss, who were recovering from their wounds and prisoners there. During the rest, Lee moved to reorganize the Army of Northern Virginia to get rid of the officers he was dissatisfied with during the 7 days, including John Bankhead Magruder, Benjamin Huger, and William Whiting. Even though he was still a brigadier, Lee put Hood in charge of the division, which was now known as Hood's Division. After another victory at the Second Battle of Manassas, Hood found himself in possession of several new Union ambulances that he divided among his regiments where they were desperately needed. Brigadier General Nathaniel Evans, technically senior to Hood, ordered the ambulances turned over to his South Carolina brigade. Hood refused, and when Lee found out, had him arrested. Hood's troops marched from Hagerstown to Boonesboro, Maryland to reinforce D.H. Hill's troops, who had come under a Union attack. Robert E. Lee sat on his horse Traveler, watching the procession. As the men passed by Lee, they shouted out, "Give us Hood!" To which Lee doffed his hat and replied, "You shall have him, gentlemen." After meeting with Hood, who was following in the rear, Lee suspended his arrest, and he rejoined his troops. They would soon be fighting in the bloody Battle of Sharpsburg.
Sharpsburg was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. It had the most men killed in one day in all the war. And it's a fascinating story because the Texas Brigade was really decimated after Sharpsburg.
Hood suffered tremendous losses at Sharpsburg. The Texas Brigade lost over 550 of its 850 men, with the 1st Texas suffering an 82% casualty rate in Miller's cornfield, which caused Hood great distress. When asked later by General Lee about his division, he replied, "They are lying on the field where you sent them, sir. My division is almost wiped out." For his efforts at Sharpsburg, Hood was promoted to Major General on October the 20th, 1862. In another reorganization of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee promoted Jerome Robertson to command the Texas Brigade and assigned Hood's division to James Longstreet's new 1st Army Corps. At the same time, 2 new brigades were added to Hood's division, now with a strength of 7,064 men. In November, an inspection of the division led to a reprimand for Hood for the sad state of his troops, causing Lee to comment on Hood that he was a good fighter, very industrious on the battlefield, careless off. Finding adequate clothes, shoes, and hats was a constant problem for Hood. Their raggedness was so obvious that on a visit by a British observer, Lee told his visitor, "Never mind their raggedness, Colonel. The enemy never sees the backs of my Texans." In mid-November, to counter the movements of the newly reorganized Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General Ambrose Burnside, Lee moved Longstreet's corps and later Jackson's to Fredericksburg in anticipation of a battle. Hood took up position on the right flank of Longstreet's corps, and so on the 12th of December, Hood could only watch as wave after wave of Union troops attacked Marye's Heights and were annihilated. The same was true on the 13th, as Jackson's corps on Hood's right repelled Union attacks at the slaughter pen. After the battle, the division set up winter quarters on the heights behind Fredericksburg. The men built makeshift huts and cut firewood while the officers busied themselves doing their post-battle reports. They also built a log theater for performances by Hood's minstrels. Both Hood and General Lee attended performances of the minstrels, which included Gus and Molly Bailey. Gus was the band leader of the 3rd Arkansas, which had now joined Hood's Texas Brigade. Before the war, Gus and Molly had operated a vaudeville show in Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas, and in Arkansas. Molly was the leading lady, soloist, and organist. The story also goes that Molly was a spy for the brigade, sneaking across the Potomac River dressed as an old lady and bringing back quinine hidden in her hair. In February 1863, General Joe Hooker, who was now the commander of the Army of the Potomac after Burnside was relieved after the fiasco at Fredericksburg, moved the 9th Corps to Fort Monroe. In response, Lee moved Pickett's and Hood's divisions to Richmond. Hood made camp about 4 miles south of Richmond between Richmond and Petersburg on the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad line. Once again, Hood was generous with the passes for his men to visit Richmond. Hood also took advantage of being so close to Richmond. There was a vibrant social scene that was presided over by Jefferson Davis' wife, Verena, Mary Chestnut, the wife of a wealthy plantation owner, senator, and colonel, Charlotte Wigfall, the wife of former U.S. Senator General and current Confederate Senator Louis Wigfall, and Carolyn Hampton Preston, the wife of another wealthy planter and the daughter of Wade Hampton. Hood didn't waste any opportunity to attend the dinners, musicals, and theater parties attended by Richmond's political and military elite. But that soon came to an end when Longstreet decided to send Hood's and Pickett's division on a foraging expedition to southeast Virginia, a small campaign known as the Siege of Suffolk. They spent the month of April collecting corn, bacon, and fodder for their horses, which made the locals none too happy. On April the 30th, Longstreet received orders to return to Richmond to be ready to reinforce Jackson at Chancellorsville. But he delayed so long that by the time he was ready to leave, the battle was over. Upon the division's return to Richmond, Hood renewed his friendship with Mary Chestnut through his surgeon, John T. Darby, a South Carolinian like Chestnut. Hood and Darby came to the Chestnuts to ask Mary and the Preston girls to go on a picnic at Drury's Bluff. 19-year-old Sally Preston, known as Buck, was lovely, popular, and the center of Mary Chestnut's social circle. And Hood, 11 years her senior, was immediately smitten. But the next morning, as they were getting ready to leave, Hood was ordered to join Lee on the Rappahannock. They were headed to Gettysburg.